The year was 1886, and the last warmth of a Wyoming summer was bleeding out of the high plains, leaving behind the brittle, golden grasses and a sky the color of a faded bruise. Alara Vance stood at the foot of the ridge, her two children, Caleb and Lyra, huddled close to her worn skirts. Before them, the land rose up in a crumpled spine of granite and ancient, dark rock that the local ranchers in Promise Creek called the Ironback. To most, it was a useless and impassable feature of the landscape, a barrier that forced the cattle trails south and snagged the worst of the winter winds. To Alara, it was the only thing that stood between her family and utter ruin. Her husband, Thomas, was 3 months gone, taken by a fever that had swept through their small homestead with the indifference of a prairie fire. And with him had gone the legal claim to their land, a technicality of paperwork that a lone woman with no coin could not fight. They had been cast out not with malice, but with the quiet, bureaucratic certainty of a world that had little room for widows. Caleb, at 8 years old, tried to mimic his father's stoic posture, his small shoulders squared against the vastness of their predicament. 6-year-old Lyra simply held on to her mother's hand, her gaze fixed on the imposing wall of stone. Alara's eyes, however, were not on the granite peaks, but on a darker seam running through the rock face about 100 feet above the valley floor. It was a fissure, a jagged mouth of shadow that Thomas had once pointed out on a ride, dismissing it as a wolf's den or some trick of the light. But Alara had seen more. She had seen how the snows of the previous winter had melted away from that specific spot faster than anywhere else on the ridge, forming a damp, dark patch on the rock while the rest of the world remained buried in white. It was a small observation, one she had tucked away without conscious thought, but now it returned to her with the force of a lifeline. She was not merely looking for shelter. She was hunting a principle, a half-forgotten piece of wisdom that Thomas had heard and discarded, but which she had held onto like a secret stone in her pocket. The first few days were a blur of desperate labor. With a spade and a small pickaxe, the only tools of value she had been allowed to keep, Alara began to clear a path up the scree slope toward the fissure. The work was brutal. Her hands, accustomed to kneading dough and mending clothes, were soon raw and blistered. The children gathered what little firewood they could find, their small hands piling twigs and fallen branches into a precious mound. On the third day, a rider appeared on the horizon, slowly resolving into the familiar shape of Hiram Poole on his sturdy gray gelding. Hiram was a man of substance in the valley, his ranch sprawling over the best grazing land. He was not unkind, but his mind operated on the straight, predictable lines of fences and ledgers. He reined in his horse, his expression a mixture of pity and profound confusion. "Mistress Vance," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "What in God's name are you doing?" Alara paused, leaning on her spade, and wiped a smear of dirt from her brow with the back of her forearm. "I am making a home, Mr. Poole," she answered, her voice even, betraying none of the exhaustion that thrummed in her bones. Hiram's gaze drifted from the determined set of her jaw to the dark opening in the rock above. He squinted, his practical mind failing to find any logic in the scene before him. "A home? In there?" He shook his head, a slow, pitying gesture. "That's a cave, woman. A den for predators, or a tomb of ice come winter. You and those children will freeze solid before the first real snow." He saw her not as a person executing a plan, but as a creature addled by grief, scrabbling at a rock face in a fit of madness. It was the safer position, amusement tinged with concern, and it absolved him of any need to understand. His wife, Dorothea, had already made her pronouncements in the small collection of buildings that constituted Promise Creek. The word had spread quickly, as it always did, passed over washboards and sacks of flour at the general store. The poor widow Vance had lost her senses along with her husband, digging into the ironback like a badger. It was a tragedy, they murmured. A shame that she was too proud to accept charity, which mostly meant a cot in a storeroom and a life of taking in laundry for ranchers' wives. Ruth Hartley, whose small plot bordered what had once been the Vance claim, had said little. She had watched Alara leave with her children, her face a mask of quiet sympathy. Now, from her own porch, she could sometimes see the tiny, distant figure of Alara working on the mountainside, a persistent, solitary speck of motion against the unyielding stone. And she alone, among the chorus of doubters, felt not pity, but a knot of cautious curiosity. Hiram Poole dismounted, his boots crunching on the loose rock. He was a man who believed in what he could see and touch: stout timber, well-packed sod, the tight seal of a window frame against the wind. "My wife could use help at the ranch," he offered, his tone gentle, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "You could have a room, warm meals. It's no life for you and the little ones, out here clawing at a mountain." Alara looked at him, at his well-fed frame and his clean, sturdy clothes, and she saw the gulf between their worlds. His was a world of known quantities, of solutions that had been proven by generations of men before him. Hers was now a world of desperate necessity, where the only hope lay in a principle the world had overlooked. "The earth holds its own heat, Mr. Poole," she said, the words simple, yet holding the entirety of her gamble. "Deeper in. It is warmer in the winter than any house you can build." Hiram stared at her, his brow furrowed. He had heard prospectors and mad old trappers spin similar yarns about hot springs and vents of steam. But this was just a crack in a cold rock. He saw no evidence, no logic. Watching an outcome, like the melting snow, was not the same as understanding the principle. "That's foolish talk, Mistress Vance. With respect. The ground freezes 6 feet deep here. That cave will draw the cold in and never let it go. It will be a block of ice." He gestured back toward the valley. "You're welcome at our place. The offer stands. But don't expect me to come pulling you out of that hole when the first blizzard hits." He mounted his horse, gave a final, sad shake of his head, and rode away, secure in his knowledge and the correctness of his world. Alara watched him go, then turned back to the rock. His doubt was like the wind, a constant, meaningless pressure. It could not help her. It could not stop her. The memory that fueled her was not her own, but one borrowed and preserved. Years ago, Thomas, ever eager for a paying contract, had spent a summer guiding a geologist from the east, a man with spectacles and a passion for the bones of the earth. One evening, the man had sat by their fire, sketching the very ridge Alara now faced. He had spoken of its volcanic origins, of the hollow tubes left behind by ancient lava flows, arteries within the stone. Thomas, a man of wood and soil, had been politely dismissive. But Alara, mending a shirt in the firelight, had listened. The geologist explained that deep earth acts as a colossal reservoir of thermal energy, absorbing the sun's heat all summer and bleeding it out slowly through the winter. He spoke of thermal mass, of how a great weight of stone could hold a temperature with immense stability, shielding anything within it from the violent temperature swings of the surface. In a deep enough cave, particularly an old volcanic tube, the man had said, his eyes alight with enthusiasm, the temperature might hardly vary from 50 degrees year-round. A natural cellar, or even a dwelling. Thomas had laughed. A dwelling for snakes and bears, maybe. But Alara had filed the information away, connecting it to old stories her own grandfather, a miner in the mountains of the old country, had told about the steady, cool but not cold air deep in the shafts, no matter the season. With Hiram's pity still hanging in the air, Alara turned her full attention back to the fissure. It was time to go inside. Leaving Caleb in charge with a stern warning to stay put, she lit a precious tallow lamp, took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, and squeezed into the opening. The first 10 feet were a narrow, damp passage of jagged rock that scraped at her clothes. The air grew still and cool, the scent changing from pine and sun-baked dust to a deep, mineral odor of wet stone and ancient darkness. The light from her lamp threw dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. She moved slowly, testing each footstep, her heart a steady drum against her ribs. The passage then began to widen and slope gently downward. The floor became smoother, the walls curving into a distinct, almost perfect tube. The geologist's words echoed in her mind. This was not a simple crack. It was a lava tube. She pushed onward, the silence broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the darkness ahead and the soft scuff of her own boots. The air was not frigid as Hiram had predicted. It was cool, yes, but it was a living coolness, not the dead, biting cold of a winter shadow. She felt it on her skin, a steady, neutral presence. After what she guessed was 60 feet, the tunnel opened dramatically into a larger space, a chamber roughly 20 feet across and high enough for her to stand upright with room to spare. The floor was uneven, covered in a mix of dirt and loose rock that had washed in or fallen from the ceiling over centuries. But the chamber itself was sound. She held the lamp high, its golden light revealing walls of dark vesicular basalt, pocked with the bubbles of gas that had escaped as the lava cooled millennia ago. It was dry. There was no sign of animals, no bones, no droppings. It was simply an empty, waiting space, a hollow heart within the mountain. Here, the air was completely still, utterly shielded from the wind that she could hear as a faint, distant moan back at the entrance. She placed her palm flat against the rock wall. It was cool to the touch, but it felt solid, permanent, and imbued with a deep, resonant stillness. This would be the place. The following weeks transformed Alara. The soft lines of her face hardened with purpose, and her body, already lean, became corded with the muscle of constant, repetitive labor. Her plan was a tripartite one. First, to make the chamber livable. Second, to secure the entrance against the wind. And third, to engineer a way to have a small fire for cooking and light without filling their new home with smoke. The first task was the most grueling. Day after day, she and the children worked to clear the main chamber. With her spade and a bucket, she began leveling the floor, hauling load after load of loose rock and damp earth out of the cave and dumping it down the scree slope. Caleb, understanding the gravity of their work, helped drag the smaller rocks, his face set in a serious frown of concentration. Lyra, too small for the heavy work, was put in charge of smoothing, patting down the newly leveled earth with her small hands. It was a Sisyphean task, but with every bucket of debris she removed, the chamber felt less like a cave and more like a room. She discovered the walls were not uniform. In some places, the basalt had formed natural shelves and niches, which she cleared and mentally designated as cupboards and ledges for their few belongings. Next, she focused on the entrance. A simple hole in the mountain would be a funnel for the biting winter wind. She needed a door, and more than that, an antechamber to act as an airlock. She made a risky journey back toward their old claim, moving at night to avoid notice. There, behind the main cabin, lay the collapsed remains of a small woodshed Thomas had built. The wood was weathered but sound. Over 3 nights, she painstakingly dismantled what was left of it, carrying the heavy planks and timbers on her back across the valley and up the slope to her new home. It was agonizing work, her shoulders screaming in protest, but the thought of a solid door between her children and the Wyoming winter drove her on. Using Thomas's saw and hammer, she constructed a thick, rough-hewn door and a heavy frame that she wedged deep into the mouth of the lava tube. The fit was not perfect, but it was a start. She then spent another week cutting blocks of sod from a grassy patch near the base of the ridge, hauling them up the slope and packing them into every gap between the rock and the wooden frame. She sealed it all with a thick plaster made of clay she found near a small spring, creating a nearly airtight seal. The result was a short, 10-foot-long entry tunnel, with her new wooden door at the outside end. Now, the wind could batter the door, but the sanctum of the inner chamber would remain still. The final piece of the puzzle was the most complex: ventilation. A fire, even a small one for a cook stove, would be essential, but in an enclosed space, its smoke would be a killer. She refused to trade freezing for suffocation. For days, she explored every inch of the main chamber, holding her lamp close to the ceiling, feeling for any draft, any hint of an upward passage. She finally found it in the far corner. A narrow, vertical fissure no wider than her hand, snaking up into the darkness. A tiny, almost imperceptible current of air flowed into it. This was her chimney. For a week, she worked on a rickety scaffold made of salvaged wood, using the sharp point of her pickaxe to painstakingly chip away at the edges of the fissure. It was slow, dangerous work. Shards of rock rained down, and the constant upward reach made her arms burn with a fire of their own. But slowly, painstakingly, she widened the opening to nearly a foot in diameter, a rough but functional flue that rose into the unknown mass of the mountain. She had no idea where it exited, but she trusted the principle of rising heat. The smoke would find its own way out. With her last few dollars and a trade of Thomas's good pocket knife, she acquired a small, pot-bellied cast-iron stove from a trapper passing through. She set it carefully on a flat stone directly beneath the new opening, its small stovepipe aimed at the flue. The system was complete. As autumn deepened, the interior of the cave transformed. The leveled floor was covered with burlap sacks she had saved, and on top of those, the cured hide of a deer Caleb had managed to trap with a simple snare. Rough-hewn beds were built into an alcove, filled with dry grasses and covered with their threadbare blankets. The natural shelves in the rock held their meager possessions: a few tin plates, a pot, a small stack of books. The space was dark and troglodytic, yet it was also clean, organized, and most importantly, theirs. The first time she lit a small fire in the stove, she held her breath. A small puff of smoke escaped the seams, and then, as the draft took hold, the rest was drawn steadily upward, disappearing into the fissure in the ceiling. A slow smile spread across Alara's face. It worked. The chamber filled with the gentle, radiant heat of the stove and the smell of wood smoke, but the air remained clear. They had a home. It was a home born of geological luck and sheer, unyielding will. The first blizzard of the season arrived not with gentle warning, but as a sudden, violent assault. One afternoon in late November, the sky, which had been a placid blue, curdled into a uniform leaden gray. The wind, which had been a constant whisper, rose to a mournful howl, and then to a shrieking, physical force that tore at the few remaining leaves on the aspens in the valley. From their vantage point, Alara and the children watched as the world dissolved into a churning chaos of white. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding torrent of ice crystals that erased the landscape. Down in the valley, she could just make out the faint, flickering lights of the ranches as people hunkered down, stuffing rags into window frames and piling firewood by their hearths. She imagined Hiram Poole in his sturdy house, feeling a grim satisfaction that his prediction was coming true, picturing the poor widow Vance freezing in her foolish rock pile. Ilara gathered the children and pulled them back from the entrance tunnel. She closed the heavy wooden door, the wind immediately slamming against it with the force of a battering ram. She slid a thick wooden bar into place to secure it. And then there was quiet. The shrieking gale was reduced to a dull, distant roar, the sound of a faraway ocean. The stillness inside the chamber was absolute and profound. She lit a small fire in the stove, just a few pieces of wood, enough to heat a pot of watery stew and cast a warm, flickering glow on the dark rock walls. The smoke rose obediently up the flue. Lyra, who had been terrified of the storm's noise, looked around the calm, quiet space, and her fear visibly melted away. Caleb, ever his mother's son, went to the wall and placed his hand on it, just as she had done. He looked at her, his eyes wide. "It's not cold, Mama," he whispered. For 3 days, the world outside ceased to exist. The blizzard raged, a tempest of unimaginable fury. They heard it only as a muffled bass rumble, a constant reminder of the chaos they were shielded from. Inside their mountain home, life continued with a calm, steady rhythm. They ate their warm meals, Alara read to them from one of her books, and they slept, cocooned in the deep, unwavering quiet of the earth. The stove required very little fuel. Its purpose was less for primary heat and more for cooking and comfort. The real warmth came from the rock itself. The walls were not warm, but they were a steady, constant temperature, somewhere around 50 degrees. The immense thermal mass of the mountain refused to yield to the fleeting violence of the storm. It held its temperature with the implacable patience of geology, and in doing so, it kept the chamber from freezing. Ilara tended the small fire, her movements unhurried and sure. She was not fighting the cold. She had simply stepped out of its way. She had placed her faith not in thick walls of wood that would inevitably leak and grow cold, but in the mountain itself. And it was holding them safe in its stone embrace. On the morning of the 4th day, the roaring subsided. A profound silence settled over the land. Ilara lifted the bar and pushed open the heavy door. The sight that met her eyes was breathtaking. The world had been remade in white. Snow was drifted 10 feet high against the side of the mountain, but her doorway, tucked into the rock, was mostly clear. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun shone on a landscape of pristine, sculpted snow that glittered as if sewn with diamonds. The air that hit her face was ferocious, a blade of pure cold that stole the breath from her lungs. It was a cold that felt like it could crack bone. She stood for a moment, letting the brutal reality of the Wyoming winter sink in, and then she stepped back inside the entry tunnel and closed the door. The instant it shut, the biting cold vanished. She was back in the calm, cool stillness of her home. The contrast was the entire story. It was the physical, sensory proof of the principle she had gambled everything on. The air inside felt almost balmy in comparison. A gentle, livable coolness that felt like life itself next to the killing cold outside. A quiet, deep satisfaction settled in her, a feeling more profound than triumph. It was the quiet joy of a hypothesis proven correct, of a process trusted and validated. She thought of the geologist, the man with the spectacles, and sent a silent thank you into the past. She thought of Thomas, of his casual dismissal of an idea that did not fit into his known world. She had loved him, but she saw now that his knowledge was built on tradition, on doing things the way they had always been done. Her knowledge was different. It was built on observation, on listening, and on trusting a principle even when no one else could see it. In that moment, she was not just a survivor. She was a practitioner of a deeper craft, an engineer who used the earth itself as her primary material. She had not conquered the mountain. She had partnered with it. 2 days later, a figure appeared, struggling through the immense drifts. It was a man, dark against the snow, moving with the slow, exhausted gait of someone at the end of their endurance. As he drew closer, Alara recognized the familiar bulk of Hiram Poole. His face was chapped raw by the wind, and his eyes were hollowed out with fatigue and desperation. He did not come with offers of charity now. He came as a supplicant. He stopped 20 feet from her door, breathing hard, his shoulders slumped. "Mistress Vance," he called, his voice rough. "The snow, the weight of it. It broke a beam in my roof. The wind is coming through. We've had the fire roaring for 2 days straight, and we're still freezing. My youngest has a fever." He paused, and the next words cost him a great deal. "I saw no smoke from your place. I thought the worst, but I had to check." Alara simply nodded and held the door open for him. Hiram trudged the last few feet and stepped into the entry tunnel. As she closed the door behind him, he flinched, expecting the cramped darkness to be even colder than the air outside. Instead, he was met with still, cool air and the faint smell of wood smoke and cooking. He walked the 10 feet into the main chamber and stopped dead. His eyes, accustomed to the blinding glare of the snow, struggled to adjust to the dim light of the lamp and the small stove. He saw the children, wrapped in blankets but looking healthy and calm. He saw the neat, orderly space. But what he felt was what truly staggered him. The air was not warm, not like in his house with a fire blazing, but it was utterly without chill. It was a stable, peaceful temperature that felt more welcoming than his own drafty, freezing home. He reached out a hand and laid it flat against the dark rock wall, his face a canvas of disbelief. "My God, woman," he whispered, his voice thick with awe. It's not even cold." "How?" "The mountain," Alara said simply. "It holds the warmth of the earth." She did not say, "I told you so." There was no need. The proof was all around him, in the very air he was breathing. She ladled some of the hot stew into a bowl and handed it to him. He took it, his hands trembling slightly, and for the first time, he looked at her not with pity, but with a deep, burgeoning respect. He stayed for an hour, warming himself, his mind slowly recalibrating what he knew about the world. He took a container of the hot stew back for his family, and when he left, he did not offer charity. He asked a question. "When the thaw comes," he said, his voice humbled, "will you show me how you knew?" In the spring, Hiram Poole returned, and he did not come alone. 2 other ranchers came with him. They came not to mock or to pity, but to learn. Ilara took them inside, showed them the smooth, curved walls of the lava tube, the clever chimney, the solid door. She explained again the principle of the Earth's thermal mass, and this time, they listened. They asked questions. They touched the walls. They began to look at the ridges and hills around their own lands, not as useless obstacles, but as potential resources, as sources of shelter and stability. The idea of the winter cave began to spread through the valley, a piece of hard-won, practical wisdom that had been born from one woman's desperation and observation. Some ranchers dug out smaller versions to use as storm shelters or root cellars that never froze. Hiram, for his part, found a similar, smaller tube on his own land and developed it as a shelter for his most vulnerable livestock during the worst of the winter, saving a small fortune in lost animals the following year. Ilara's cave dwelling became her permanent home. Over the years, she and the children expanded it, clearing out 2 smaller side chambers that branched off the main one, creating separate rooms for Caleb and Lyra as they grew. The rough-hewn furniture was replaced with more carefully made pieces. The walls were whitewashed with lime, making the interior brighter and cleaner. It was never a conventional house, but it was a comfortable, secure, and deeply loved home. It became a local landmark, the Vance Cavern, a place travelers were told to look for, a testament to the quiet innovator who had dug into a mountainside and found not a tomb of ice, but a lifetime of warmth. Caleb and Lyra grew up there, and Caleb eventually took over the home with his own family, raising his children in the same steady, quiet warmth of the earth. For generations, the home served the Vance family, a living piece of history, a permanent monument to a woman who, when cast out by the world of men, had found her salvation by listening to the older, deeper wisdom of the earth itself.